Hello and welcome to ThePrint. In this week's column, I write about how there's a new foreign policy consensus emerging in today's India. A new consensus in Indian foreign and strategic policy thinking has emerged over the past 1 year, I argue. And this consensus holds that despite various proclamations, India is not yet a great power, and that its status as a rising power should not be taken for granted either. Accordingly, India should focus on costly reforms to establish the long term foundations of power rather than limiting its policy options to short term diplomatic or strategic maneuvers. If anything, these priorities require greater restraint and caution in foreign policy to support under underlying pursuit of material growth, right? And hence, there is need for caution in terms of expansion, getting entangled in conflicts abroad, or behaving or needing to behave like a classical great power. Whereas the evolving foreign policy consensus in the US has understandably hogged a lot of attention in recent months, what is more easily passed under the radar is the shift in India's own broad policy framework. This is understandable because India arguably moves much more slowly than other powers, right? But this shift is occurring towards what I like to call a post-exuberance realism. And as a country's foreign policy environment becomes more contested and multidimensional, it is only logical that its strategic culture adapts accordingly. The shift, therefore, is unsurprising and quite logical. As I had argued earlier in a different article, that key shifts in key equations among the great powers, which is Russia, China, and the US, and in their respective equations with Delhi itself, have left India occupying a much diminished geopolitical sweet spot from which to bargain. As our External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar has argued very recently, that changes in the global order have made India's relationships with the system's major powers, the same ones, China, Russia, and the US, in his words, far more challenging and complex, end quote, than they were in 2019. Do recall that he was talking in the context of his very famous book, The India Way. Indeed, 2025 has proved to be a very sobering year for Indian foreign policy, as you must have appreciated and noticed. It had seen China's deep seek moment and a growing appreciation in India of Beijing's breathtaking ascent towards superpower status. In particular, China has demonstrated its ability this year, I mean 2025, to threaten industrial supply chains in the US as well as key sectors of the Indian economy itself through its still evolving and coercive rare earth export control licensing regime. The year also saw Washington very abruptly abandon India US strategic convergence and pivot towards a softer reconciliation with China, driven by a mostly economic rationale, but also carrying strong strategic implications for Asia's future. Trump's trade war against India further exposed New Delhi's limited stock of deployable geo-economic leverage vis-a-vis both China and the US. This has become increasingly evident to us. As external bottlenecks have hardened abroad, India has been forced to finally confront internal constraints. And this has been evident in recent efforts to boost domestic demand through GST simplification and also through the push towards labor law reforms. Meanwhile, India also had to confront the extent of the deepening of the China Pakistan strategic and defense relationship in May last year during Operation Sindoor. This has been something that had faded from public consciousness since 2019, 2020, and hence with Operation Sindoor, an old ghost that we had thought that we had buried has come back to haunt us to a degree. Meanwhile, China's continued infrastructure development along the LAC, combined with its growing economic leverage over India, has enabled Beijing to underwrite trilateral cooperation with both Afghanistan to our west and Bangladesh to our east, and with Pakistan on its side in both cases. The emergence of Turkey as a military ally and defense supplier to several states in the Indian Ocean region as well as to Philippines has not escaped Indian attention either. Together, these developments necessitate a sober reckoning with the structural weaknesses in India's armaments policy, as well as a measure of military restraint in the short term. India's Chief of Defense Staff General Anil Chauhan appeared to allude to this last week when he emphasized the need to avoid attritional warfare amid increasing geopolitical uncertainty. Now, these setbacks are hard to brush aside and are now seen as more than merely chance based. They possess instead a deeper structural basis and meaning. These are not just coincidences in different silos. As a result, India today has far less maneuvering room in the conduct of foreign policy than it did a few years ago. The experience of Operation Sindoor has also underscored, despite the success of the Indian Air Force, the urgency of building up military capabilities, but with greater reference to the growing strength of adversaries rather than to self referential constraints or our own past achievement. India has also felt the consequences of remaining outside key global supply chains, and its ability to benefit from China plus one opportunities is also constrained by its own domestic bottlenecks, both administrative and economic. One central thesis of this argument that I'm putting forward is that a new fact has been acknowledged widely that India's time has not yet come. This is contrary to the title of the famous book by Elisa Ayres in 2018 called Our Time Has Come. And along with that, the realization that India's eventual destiny as a great power is far from guaranteed. Now, after exuberance, which is after, let's say, 15 years of this enthusiasm, India must now not only take difficult and costly steps towards industrialization, but also convert growth into geo-economic leverage and military modernization. One recalls that despite our best efforts, India's manufacturing growth has remained largely the same over the last 10 to 12 years, and hence whereas US is struggling with deindustrialization, India's struggle is to get there in the first place. This realization that India is not yet a great power stands in contrast to the meta policy framework of the past few years, yet it's influencing policy planning, albeit gradually, even right now. The signs of this shift towards a new consensus are now visible across op-eds, think tank reports, roundtable discussions, and popular podcasts. As someone I know had observed recently, the vibe seems to have shifted a little bit. To give more examples, Jethard Rao, a very well known free market proponent, has recently called for a qualified acceptance of the statist Frederick List rather than the more beloved to classical liberals Adam Smith. And relatedly, he also asked for a relook at Nehruvian planning because of its alignment with war building capacities and, of course, national self defense. He is making this shift himself in light of the growing realization of the strategic imperatives. Now, this link between domestic economic debates and the road to prosperity and military power is now an increasingly recognized correlation and far more common than it used to be. This is because everyone now understands growth rates do not automatically lead to military power. For instance, Lieutenant General Raj Shukla, while appreciating India's recent defense policy innovations, has described them recently as largely tinkering and falling short of what is actually needed, which is a transformation beyond measure and a full embrace of civil military fusion for future warfare. Veteran diplomat Ambassador Vivek Kaju has similarly noted that India's self congratulatory discourse has contributed to near intractable foreign policy challenges, not least in its dealings with the Trump administration. Now, toward the end of the year, increasing attention was also paid to Turkey's ascent in global and regional politics, driven in large measure by its impressive defense industrial base and its achievements. Now, this has enhanced Ankara's influence across the Indian Ocean region and into Southeast Asia, in turn raising uncomfortable comparisons with India's own limited efforts to expand influence through military sales and security assistance. Now, foreign policy analyst Professor C. Rajamohan underscored one of the key realizations to have crystallized in 2025 for India, and I quote him: the focus has to be economic. Unless you accelerate your internal transformation, the goal of Vikshit Bharat cannot be achieved by clever diplomatic play. Now, military veterans and foreign policy analysts appear to converge on what the guiding security goal for the next few years should be, which is military overmatch vis a vis Pakistan in service of compellence and asymmetric deterrence against China's growing military presence along the LAC. Deterrence itself, you would notice, is spoken more in terms of conventional warfare capabilities than signaling alone. In India's new military thinking, we no longer talk simply in terms of short and swift wars, which reflecting a greater appreciation for the fact that wars in the future may be long and attritional. Meanwhile, Trump's tariff pressure had led to a sudden breakthrough consensus, in that India must ditch protectionism despite the global drift in that direction and return to the almost forgotten agenda of structural reforms. These are seen as essential to unlocking manufacturing productivity, to generate jobs, and to integrate India into global supply chains. Now, economists, CEOs, journalists, analysts, and I'll give some names, for instance, and you can look up their work, like Rajat Kathuria, Shekhar Gupta, of course, you'd know, Manish Sabharwal, Sandeep Bharadwaj, and Hajun Chang, have reinforced this argument through their analysis of India's trade negotiating strategies, its endemic fear of free trade, and the causes of the still pending industrialization and the need for specific reforms and course correction. Now, such commentary and their resonance is striking for a few reasons. First, there appears to be a growing agreement among thought leaders, not only on what needs to be done, but also how these prescriptions reinforce one another at the conceptual level. Such a consensus should be prized and built upon. This is because without the same, India may gradually succumb to a form of policy paralysis, unable to make sense of the layered and intertwined systemic challenges. Hence, at this point, it is key that the shift and the core differences between the old consensus and the new consensus is spelled out, and to discern the degree of both disruption as well as relative continuation. At the heart of this shift towards the new consensus, I would argue, lies three key calibrations, and I shall go through them one by one. The first is our perception of power itself and the role of perceptions in power. Now, the previous consensus, which I call exuberant realism, and I'd marked the dates as from 2012 to 2025, it had held that India is a leading power already or a near great power. Now, this led to the logical inference that India needed to overcome its traditional reflex of moralistic restraint and adopt a more no holds barred assertive posture and policy framework on the regional and global stage. In other words, India needs to punch according to its weight finally and from a position of confidence. Relatedly, India also needed to pursue identifiable markers of great powerness to signal, both domestically and externally, that expectations now had changed and countries needed to adopt to this new reality of India. Now, it was assessed that perceptions of greater power beget more power, creating a virtuous cycle. If everyone thinks that you are very powerful, they would treat you as if you are, right? And hence that gives you more and more leverages. This view is captured well in the scholar Manjeet Pardesi's view of the three parameters that had made India a great power in 2015. And I quote him: the presence of security related and economic interests outside of a state's home region, the requisite capabilities, and the demand for its status and its acceptance by other great powers and the regional states. However, in the new consensus, India is still some distance away from great power capabilities and hence status, because capabilities always come first, right? The material aspects of power in this new view are emphasized more. The sequence preference is more Deng Xiaoping than Kaiser Wilhelm, which is build power before spending it. Furthermore, the pursuit of status based on insufficient internal development attracts greater troubles abroad, while also diverting attention and focus from the pursuit of real capabilities to it. In other words, it is more rewarding to be powerful than to feel it. The second shift is regarding our view of the international order and the role of conflicts and interest within that. The previous consensus emerged in the context of a still unipolar and relatively stable US led world order. India's sweet spot as a swing state between a positively dispositioned US and a rising China, or a still rising China, created significant maneuvering room for playing both sides for more bargaining and greater dividends. Within this international system, growing divergence among established great powers, think US, China, Russia, created rooms of opportunity that could be cleverly exploited by middle powers or rising powers and an increasingly multipolar world. Hence, Indian foreign policy very often drifted towards positional diplomacy. The new consensus, on the other hand, sees India enjoying little to none maneuvering room in the emergent bi to multipolar order. Rather than opportunities that could be used to hasten India's ascent to great power status, global conflicts are now increasingly recognized as sources of constraint on India's rise. One can think about both the Russia Ukraine war as well as the ongoing US China trade war. As the world becomes more fluid and multipolar, it becomes more conflict prone, requiring India to prepare material defenses more urgently than previously assessed and without relying on a perceived geopolitical advantage. This also implies calls for a foreign policy that is more tempered, that advocates peace at the global stage more forcefully, and suggests restraint vis a vis adversaries without signaling weakness. A significant and transformative defense build-up will require a diplomacy of assurance rather than assertion in this new view. The third key shift is regarding the meaning of the domestic basis of power and its impact on foreign policy. Now, in the previous consensus, it was largely assumed that India's power fundamentals, which are a large population, nuclear weapons, high growth rate, and a slew of targeted policies aimed at generating manufacturing growth, that these are secure and would propel India towards great power status. In the sense that India's rise was inevitable and secure. Structural reforms in this view were seen as optional rather than necessary. There was a belief also that India's pockets of technological successes could be combined with its geopolitical sweet spot and partnership with like minded states to leapfrog into leadership positions in future industries. Think AI, robotics, and so on. In the new consensus, the linkages between domestic bases of power, manufacturing, defense industry being the key, and foreign policy outcomes are both understood and emphasized more. There is greater concern with operational aspects of power rather than its more theoretical formulations. Hence, foreign policy analysts as well as military veterans are increasingly taking an interest in economic matters and vice versa. India will find it extremely challenging to leapfrog to future industries without establishing a more traditional manufacturing system at home. The new consensus emphasizes that India's trade troubles with the US and military insecurity with Pakistan and China call for more things to be done at home rather than in either firmer strategic alignment, which is ruled out for the short term, or greater positional politics among the great powers, such as improving ties which are now domineering China. This systemic consensus shift was a long time coming. It is valuable and probably the best thing that can happen to India and its well wishers this year. The old consensus had led to many advancements. It had fostered a focus on emerging and critical tech. It had introduced notable defense reforms and unlocked several foreign policy pivots that enhanced India's status, bargaining powers, and habits of cooperation with like minded partners. It had established a broader vision for India's goals and ambitions, and in a way that enjoyed widespread support from all sections of society. However, the dividends from many of the same initiatives remained constrained by systemic internal deficiencies that remained beneath the surface, escaping resolution. The new consensus seeks to preserve these ambitions through greater realism without the exuberance and the romanticization. It also calls for more international cooperation, a more domestic focus on nation building prior to its assertion on the world stage, as well as the emotional choice of delayed gratification over immediate status enjoyment. If the consensus is strengthened, it is likely to have a systemic and permeating impact on India's policy planning across domains. A more mature understanding of power will encourage better policy design, tailoring means and ends with sensitivity to long term buildup of power rather than short term impact. It will also make India a better economic and defense partner due to the growing pragmatism, for instance, and the realization that New Delhi needs its like minded partners more, not less. One can think here of the EU, South Korea, Japan, Australia. Now, India's recent efforts to repair ties with Canada, undertake aggressive FTA, especially with the EU, cultivate Europe in general, stabilize economic linkages with China, and manage Trump's America without mutual recrimination are all somewhat indicative of this shift already. India may have felt more powerless in 2025 than at any time since 1991, perhaps. But history shows that New Delhi has often got its act together when its back has been against the wall, rather than when it has enjoyed sufficient growth rates and a safe external environment. Thank you for watching The Print.